A temporary truce for the start of the school year slows fighting in eastern Ukraine between the Ukrainian military and pro-Russian fighters, and there are renewed efforts to resume talks between Moscow and Kiev. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. It's been 2 years since diplomatic efforts began to stop the fighting in eastern Ukraine after Russia's annexation of Crimea. The first ceasefire came in September of 2014 with the Minsk Protocol signed by Russia, Ukraine and rebel representatives. That was followed by a second Minsk agreement in February 2015 with the help of Germany and France. With each agreement, a ceasefire was issued and each time failed to bring peace. Now there are renewed efforts to resume talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Daria Bondarchuk from Moscow. And Daria, the foreign ministers of Germany and France are expected to travel to Kiev next week in hopes of restarting these talks with Ukraine and Russia on the Minsk agreement. What is President Vladimir Putin's view on this? Does he support these new talks?
Well, yes, speaking to journalists last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that there is basically no alternative to these Normandy 4 talks on de-escalation and Ukraine. He said that good or bad, the Normandy 4 format is one of the ways to try to resume the negotiations between the warring sides in Ukraine. Earlier, these talks, as you know, initially have been planned to be held on the sidelines of the G20 summit in China, but following the escalation of tensions on the border between Ukraine and Crimea, and after reports that the Russian intelligence service FSB detained a group of saboteurs which claimed that were prepared and trained in Ukraine, the Kremlin said that these talks in Normandy 4 format were senseless. But since then, it seems that the stance have softened a bit, and Vladimir Putin has indicated last week that Russia will support peace negotiations in the Normandy 4 format.
Now, we had tensions flaring up between Russia and Ukraine over the summer after Moscow accused Kiev of attempting armed incursions into Russia-annexed Crimea. What can you tell us about that incident?
Well, early in August, the Russian intelligence service, FSB, has reported that it had averted several terror attacks in Crimea. It also said it detained a group of saboteurs that Moscow claimed were trained by Ukraine and were sent into Crimea and tasked to hold terror attacks on the peninsula. Kiev has denied all the accusations, and NATO said that Russia later did not provide any proof to its claims. But following those tensions, Russia said that there will be some response to that, and Kiev also has put its troops on high alert. So there's been some tensions. The two countries really were close to the brink of, if not war, but some open military standoff, as some experts said back then.
Now, Russia is conducting large-scale military drills right now on Ukraine's eastern border in the area around Crimea, which is under the control of Russia. What's involved in these war games?
Well, these are the Caucasus 2016 drills. They involve over 12,000 servicemen from Navy, Airborne and Airspace Forces and the Black Fleet Forces. These drills will last until September 10th. These are, of course, large-scale drills that Russia say are part of larger countrywide drills and checkups that were planned to be carried out throughout 2016. Now, what's interesting that these drills come just several weeks after snap checks that were conducted across the military districts bordering Ukraine. Those were called following that particular escalation over the incident in Crimea, and they ended just on the 31st of August. So we can basically talk about several weeks of continued trainings with a short gap between them. That, of course, have alerted both Kiev and many countries in Eastern Europe, and they have called for NATO to step up its obligations and ensure that it can protect countries in Ukraine and the Baltic states in particular against what they said saw was Russian military aggression.
Okay, thanks, Daria. That's CCTV's Daria Bondarchuk reporting from Moscow. Joining us now in our Washington, D.C. studio is Valery Charlie. He is the ambassador of Ukraine to the United States. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Right, so we have renewed tensions in Ukraine right now. Russia has accused Ukraine of conducting armed incursions into Crimea, which is under the control of Russia. The German foreign minister has expressed his concerns over these developments. What is Ukraine's response to these concerns?
It's accusation of Russia, the same thing like claims on the non-presence of Russian troops in the Ukrainian territory. Now everybody knows that it's a very cynic and insane to say it. And by the way, Vladimir Putin last week recognized the second time. I remember reports of you 2 years ago on Crimea, and that time they did not recognize the presence of Russian special operations forces. Now they recognize. And I can show you how many forces now in the eastern part of Ukraine. We have up to 6,000 Russian troops and up to 40,000 troops of Russian base. So that's a problem, the occupation of the part of Ukrainian territory and this situation in Crimea. Terroristic attack, if we speak about terroristic attack, I want to remind you, MH17, now investigation in continue, they were waiting the report. So that's a terroristic attack. And I can say very firm, our official position, we will never ever use a terroristic attack in our Ukrainian Crimea, because we still supply electricity, we supply fresh water to Crimea. It's our people, temporary occupied territory. So it's not a reason made it. But what's the main problem? How to stop terroristic attack in this temporary occupied territory? That's the problem of the eastern part of Ukraine, in this Russian-Ukraine conflict.
Now we have these new efforts to reach some kind of ceasefire deal, some kind of peace in the region. Russia's calling for restraint and says, look, the Minsk peace accords brokered by European nations should be at the center of any kind of peace settlement. What is Ukraine's view on this? Is the problem the fact that Ukraine and Russia may have different interpretations of the Minsk agreement?
Well, I participated in this negotiation, like Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to the President of Ukraine and member of delegation. I participated in prepared Minsk arrangements. Right. Frankly, very criticized inside my country because it was compromise. And we go on this compromise. But what's important is in compromise, not to take one position from Buffett, but like all these arrangements. What's important? Important to have security, withdraw the weapons, withdraw the heavy artillery, tanks, everything, to release hostages and close the border. And in the same time, we can begin, and we did it, Ukraine did it, political process. So after that, we can go further with political process, and finally, we will to implement these arrangements. It's the only way how we achieved it. By the way, President of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, last week in his address to the people in the parliament, mentioned this also only way how to resolve this conflict diplomatic means. But in the same time, we understand there's no trust, and we should have a strong military capabilities to stop such attempts of next aggression. You know, you see now that we have up to 100,000 Russian troops around our territory, and 40,000 inside these Russian big tourists. So we have a huge problem with next steps, and responsibility all partners, all the sides, very important. And that's why it's good news that next week we will have in Kiev ministers of foreign affairs of French and German.
The Russians would say these troops are there because these exercises have been planned a long time ago.
I remember, once again, your 2 years ago report about this exercise before the fake referendum and attempt of annexation of Crimea, former occupation of Crimea. That's why we do not trust Russia. And that's the main problem. So if we have some exercise with to increase capabilities with tanks, everything, aircrafts and everything, we should be prepared.
Right, so I'm wondering, how do you overcome these differences? Because there are very widely divergent views on what is taking place right now in the region. Let's take a listen to what the Russian President Vladimir Putin had to say. Let's watch.
This attempt to provoke an outbreak of violence, to provoke a conflict, is nothing other than a desire to divert public attention from the country by those who took power in Kiev, to continue to stay in power and to continue stealing from their own people.
What do you make of that?
I think we have, frankly, I do not want to comment President of Russia, but I can once again say this was lie about the non-presence of Russian troops in Ukrainian territory. So this now is really problematic to trust every word that even President of Russia mentioned. But without Russia, impossible to find a solution. That's why we want to have Russia on the table. And I believe Russia to find the right decision, because future and the strategy, it helps Russia a lot. So I think it's also in Russia's interest, as soon as possible, to stop this violation of human rights in Crimea, to make the right decision, strategic decision, only in that case of restore Ukrainian territorial integrity. More than 100 countries did not recognize that. So Ukraine will never give up Crimea or this case for Russia. It's impossible because our people. That's why its peace process should continue. But at the same time, we should understand that Ukraine now lose and pay a very big price for that. More than 10,000 people killed and tens of thousands wounded, up to 2.5 refugees. So that's the case, and we should stop it. And Russia should take own responsibility to implement Minsk arrangements.
There is a lull in the fighting right now. It's being described as the back-to-school ceasefire. What can you tell us about the security situation in that area known as the Donbass area?
From one hand, it's Beijing summit to G20 was very important because it was meeting, and I want to mention and underline that in that meeting, Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande, and President of the United States Barack Obama, they agreed among them not meet without Ukrainian side on that meeting, and after that, next decision for normative format. What we have now.
Were the Russians present at that meeting?
Yes, also they have bilateral meetings with Russian president, but not together. And what we have now, we agreed, and we are Ukrainians ready from 1st of September. It's a very good day for children, for peace. We won't have a peace like a leader of China mentioned about economy, about sustainable development. We won't have peninsula like a peace peninsula, Crimea for the future. Unfortunately, we not have the same position from our side, from Russia. But from 1st of September, we believe that we have this ceasefire. Unfortunately, yesterday, one soldier Ukrainian died and 2 wounded, and opened the shelling from the heavy artillery of 122 millimeters is prohibited by Minsk arrangements. That's why it's a very fragile situation, but I believe we will maintain this ceasefire.
Right, if we look at the positions of the two sides, Russia says that it is reviewing what it calls counterterrorism security measures on the Crimea border. It's carrying out these military drills, as I mentioned earlier on. On the Ukrainian side, President Petro Poroshenko says that he's ordered all Ukrainian units near Crimea, in eastern Ukraine as well, to be at the highest state of combat readiness. That's ratcheting it up, isn't it?
Well, we keep this readiness every time for this war for 2 years. But in this, when you open exercise and preparation for the possible attack, you should be prepared and respond for that. But in the same time, once again, we will not use any activity in the Crimea, Ukrainian territory, but we understand how it's sensitive now, so we want to finalize with Donbass, but we will not forget about Crimea. So for Crimea, it's only peace process possible, and I believe in that case we'll find a solution. But if anybody to make an accusation on Ukraine, they should think about own steps. Firstly, because it should be from the road from both sides, by 2 ways, not only 1 way. And what's important, without international support, without international community, we will not resolve this conflict, because it's not Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It's a conflict of Russia with all the world that they want to restore international order. And by the way, I would appreciate for all the countries who did not recognize Crimea occupation.
Ambassador, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We are going to take a break right now, but next we'll bring you the Russian perspective from two scholars about the conflict in Ukraine. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing diplomatic efforts to end the fighting in eastern Ukraine between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian fighters. Joining us now from Rhode Island is Vladimir Goldstein. He is an associate professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. And here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Anton Fedyashin. He is a professor of history at American University and a specialist in Russian and European history. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. Vladimir, let me start with you. Listening there to Ambassador Valerie Charlie, it seems that the two sides are so far apart in how they view this conflict in eastern Ukraine. You know, we've seen two agreements in 2 years, still no peace. Is there any reason to believe that this new round of talks that we're going to see is going to bring peace to the region?
Well, there is always hope, but I didn't hear in the words of Ambassador anything really, positive, anything which can give one sort of, confidence that the Ukrainian side wants to look at things realistically, and rather than coming up with the slogans which are 2 years old, and rather than remaining very incalcitrant. Let's consider for a second what's going on in eastern Ukraine. It's continued to be bombed and shelled by Kiev forces which want to subjugate it. That's their purpose. They already killed about 10,000 people there. In eastern Ukraine now, when the whole thing started maybe 2 years ago, maybe they were willing to negotiate, maybe they would have been interested. But if you can imagine any group of population, if 10,000 people are killed, if more than 1 million are forced to exile, they're now not willing to surrender. And they do appeal to Russians, to help them. But I would also say what is important for your readers to know is that Kiev appointed a military civilian leader. His name is Zhebrinsky, Pavel Zhebrinsky, who observed situation in eastern Ukraine and basically said nobody now wants to go back. If we ever get rid of, Soviet influence, Russian influence, we will still have to have military presence in every major city. In other words, he himself aware that eastern Ukraine doesn't want to be part of Ukraine under these conditions of bombing and shelling. And Ambassador, for some reason, refuses to acknowledge it, that this is the people in eastern Ukraine. They already had their referendums, and they already said that we cannot be part of this country, of this entity, which keeps on shelling us and bombing us. So, of course, Ambassador or Kiev regime can insist that, we'll do something until we cannot do anything until the Russians move. But the problem is that people on the ground don't want it. And on this note, I would also add that it is in the interest of Kiev to continue this military escalation, because the only thing that the regime seems to be running nowadays is on Russophobia. Their economy is falling apart. They have difficulties getting money. The only way for them to get some help is by claiming that, one more time, they're victims of Russian aggression, hoping that EU or United States will come to the rescue. Okay. That's the policy.
Anton, we heard the ambassador say several times that Ukraine will not accept a Crimea that is under the control of Russia. We see the two sides unwilling to back down. They're ramping their respective forces on both sides of the border. What do you think needs to happen for there to be some kind of lasting peace?
Well, whatever happens to bring about peace, I'm afraid at this point the Crimea will no longer be really a bargaining chip. It seems to be in Russia's control. The fact that it is absent from the Minsk agreement says that even if the Minsk agreement points are fulfilled, that's when the West will consider the acute part of this crisis over. So de facto, just judging by the text of the Minsk agreement, the Crimea is off the table for the time being. I presume that the sanctions on the Crimea will remain, but it looks like the West has made peace with it. I think that the sanctions have actually worked in favor of the people of the Crimea Crimea feeling their loyalties switch towards Russia, which the referendum reflected, because they feel like they have been punished for a democratic choice that they made during the referendum, which we know has not been recognized in the West. But for the people of the Crimea, this was their choice, and it's hard to argue against it. So again, I agree with Vladimir. There are two narratives here. Neither side seems to be backing down. So incrementally implementing the Minsk agreement is the only way to go.
All right, Vladimir, in terms of the talks that are coming up now to reach another kind of permanent ceasefire, there's a Russian newspaper called Vedomosti, which says that escalation is part of the Kremlin's tactic before negotiations. Do you believe that to be the situation?
Well, I think, there's always in every conflict we have to look at whose benefits. And clearly neither Eastern Ukraine nor Russia benefits from this escalation. But what is clear to me who benefits is, I suspect, Ukrainian side, because as I said, they like to play victim. I also think it's, who benefits is their American sponsors. Don't forget that we're on the verge of elections, and Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, more or less also similar to Ukrainian regime, she runs on Russophobia. She needs to sort of provoke Russia, so then she can point out, say, oh, Russia is bad, and my opponent Trump is a good friend, and look what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So I think this endless shellings here, there, provocation in Crimea, provocation now in in Donbass. It's but the pattern is absolutely clear. So of course, Ukrainian side can claim as much as they want about Russian interference, but common sense says Russians stand nothing to gain from that, as opposed to this to other side. It also serves as a fantastic kind of way of distraction. Because recently we just read they raised, price for utilities in Kyiv 30% and many other places. Right. Income is not increasing, so local population is not happy. So what can be better than a little, external enemy, as a little piece of Russophobia? And that's what they're doing.
Yeah. Anton, Europe, the European Union, is heavily invested in the peace process right now. We've got France involved, we've got Germany involved, but they're ruling out any kind of peacekeeping mission. There's going to be no EU peacekeeping mission to monitor any kind of ceasefire. They say, yes, there'll be police monitors, but no peacekeeping mission. So how will that be policed? And, you have the Ukrainians still talking about becoming full members of NATO.
Right. NATO's not talking about the Ukrainians becoming full members, and that's the most important aspect of this. Moreover, with the Crimea becoming part of Russia and the Ukrainians having a territorial dispute, the chances that they're becoming a full member of NATO are even more diminished than they were before. That's number one. As for Russia's position on Ukraine and moving forward, the Europeans seem to be running their Ukrainian policy on the cheap, attempting to run it on the cheap. They have made a lot of promises to Ukraine, a visa-free regime, enormous economic benefits in exchange for the signing of the association agreement, but so far none of that has actually taken place. And the Europeans really are going out of their way to prevent a full-scale quagmire. In other words, getting their troops and boots on the ground involved. So short of the OSCE observation mission, we haven't seen any commitment on the European part. Part of it is that they didn't expect the Russians to pull off what they did with the Crimea and with the support of the southeastern Ukrainian rebels. On the other hand, there seems to be Europe's facing so many problems of its own that Crimea is and Ukraine are really on the back burner. Brexit is a much bigger issue for Europe, as is the refugee crisis.
Well, tell me very quickly, is Russia prepared to accept limited autonomy for the Donbass region? Or is the bottom line that it has to be incorporated into Russia? Well,
listen, the Russians have been absolutely clear that they do not want to incorporate parts of southeast Ukraine. And the best proof of that is then when the declaration of independence took place of those two breakaway republics, Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin, refused to recognize them. So there's no question in my mind that there's no intent on the part of the Russians to incorporate these places. They are more than happy with autonomy within Ukraine. Ukraine. And that seems to be like the most constructive thing that Kiev can start moving towards right now.
Vladimir, what do you think needs to happen in the coming weeks to see some kind of settlement?
I think, I agree with Anton that Kyiv has to sort of make some kind of constructive steps in accepting some forms of autonomy and begin to view Eastern Ukraine as part of Ukraine, which just wants to be a little different, but to work with them on their conditions. Because just very recently, the Speaker of Ukrainian Parliament, Parubi, which obviously airing the views of the government, he said basically, people in Donbass, people in Eastern Europe shouldn't tell us what to do because they were moved in these territories only in 1940s under Stalin, so they are not real Ukrainians. So that's a kind of paradox. They don't consider them real Ukrainians. They want to bomb them. They kill them. So this is very interesting. When the ambassador says one of our soldiers was killed, but 10,000 civilians in Donbass were killed. They are killed there very frequently. They don't view them as real Ukrainians. Yet they want to have the territory for some reason. Don't want to give them autonomy. So until there is a recognition that people in Eastern Europe wants to live under their conditions, I don't think they want bombing to stop. They want to function like everybody else function, and Ukraine, Kyiv regime has to acknowledge it.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to both of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.